All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at Greek religion and also the mystery cults, which are a form of Greek religion that is essentially a form of private religion or personal religion, but you may have heard of those mystery cults before. Mystery religions has kind of a fancy name to it. I'll unpack that as we get further into the presentation, but I'm going to start by going over some basic terminology, as I usually do, and then we're going to look at a transition from the Mycenaean era, which we keep coming back to, through the Dark Ages and into the Archaic period, which is the period that we're focusing on. And when we covered the period of the Late Bronze Age, we talked about Minoan religion, but we didn't talk about Mycenaean religion, with the exception of maybe mentioning some of the names of gods and things that show up in the Linear B tablets. And I said I was going to hold off on talking about the Mycenaean religion because it's essentially an earlier phase of Greek religion in general. So let's jump into the PowerPoint and we'll take a look at today's topic. And the terms that I'm going to begin with are fairly general. As a matter of fact, the first couple terms that I'm going to give you, we've actually talked about before, the difference between patriarchal versus matriarchal religions. When we talked about the ancient Minoans, I brought up the theory that the Minoans had a matriarchal religious system, and that was primarily a theory based on the archaeological remains as far as physical evidence, not necessarily the written records, because even though they left behind written records like Linear A, we can't read that kind of material. And when it comes to looking at their artwork, whether it's painting or figurines, there are more female goddess figure types and images of what we believe are priestesses, which lead us to assume that they had a religion that kind of revolved around the mother goddess or around a priesthood run by priestesses. And we can contrast that with the idea of what we call patriarchal religion, where you've got a religion centered on male gods. Now, when we get to the Greek period, or rather Indo-European cultures in general, there's a talk of like the sky god figure. The idea is that these early Indo-European tribes that move into what is now Greece came from some kind of Indo-European center, filtered down into India, Persia, Greece, and Europe, and brought with them their sky god religion, and then imposed that onto societies that were already there that probably practiced some kind of mother goddess worship or some kind of form of matriarchal religion. Anyways, the patriarchal religions are assumed to be controlled by male priesthoods, and we even saw even in Sumeria, which is not an Indo-European territory originally, the kings often are believed to have emerged out of a priesthood class. Now, the matriarchal system generally focuses on the mother goddess, goddesses of nature, and it's not that the patriarchal religions don't worship gods that involve nature, because sky gods themselves, solar gods, wind gods, storm gods, things like that are obviously gods of nature, but we're talking about the gods of the heavens versus the gods of the earth or goddesses of the earth. The matriarchal religions are often assumed to be run by priestesses, predominate in agricultural societies, tend to be a little bit more peaceful. But a lot of this is really modern theory that doesn't have a lot of substantiation as far as real archaeology and textual evidence, and relies heavily on mythology and modern viewpoints. So when we talked about the Minoans, in contrast to the Mycenaeans, we did notice that the Mycenaeans have the same types of physical remains as the Minoans did, predominantly goddess figurines. But when we look at their written records, which we can read, the Linear B tablets, we see that they have kind of a 50-50 distribution between gods and goddesses. So remember, the archaeological evidence doesn't necessarily give us a full picture ever of an ancient civilization, and you need to take into consideration written records where we have them to try to get a more balanced view, and just be really hesitant to come to really strong conclusions based on fragmentary evidence. Okay, so this whole theory, matriarchal versus patriarchal religion, I'm still going to use that as kind of a framework with where we're going in a second, but I want you to be aware of being too overly confident in any kind of theory that proposes one replacing the other. Okay. Other terms that are worth mentioning: anthropomorphism. If you haven't heard the term anthropomorphic before, generally just refers to the idea of things in the form of man or things in the form of human. So when we look at Greek art, for instance, when we depict the Greek gods, they are in the form of human beings, okay, anthropomorphic, which is very different than what we saw when we looked at the gods of ancient Egypt, for instance, which has a theriomorphic tradition where you have a combination of human and animal characteristics mixed together. Now, of course, anthropomorphic doesn't necessarily just refer to the physical appearance of a character or deity. It could also refer to giving human characteristics to inanimate objects, even nature, right? When we talk about the gods of the air, attributing human characteristics to nature itself is one of the theories as to why polytheism developed the way it did. I think we talked about that when we looked at the early Sumerian religion. But I just want to bring that up because the Greeks are going to be incredibly anthropocentric, or maybe I should say humanistic. So another term that we could throw in here is humanism, which is essentially a worldview which places man at the center of the whole system, right? Man occupies the prominent position in a hierarchy of living things, for instance. When you look at the Greek philosophers, very often, man is the pinnacle. Aristotle arranges the different souls, the different types of life into different categories. And at the top, you have what he calls the rational soul, which is unique to human beings. Man is ultimately the standard of measure. So that would be something that comes from philosopher like Protagoras, who we're going to look at a little bit later when we get to the classical period. Very briefly, he's sometimes referred to as the first humanist. But essentially the idea is man has a particular value, the focus on human reason, the idea of freedom and autonomy. Those are all big ideas that the Greeks provide to Western civilization coming from this tradition. Okay, so let's jump back to Mycenaean era very briefly. What I've got up there are a couple Mycenaean goddess figurines. You might not be able to tell that. We're just talking about anthropomorphism, and here you're looking at some figurines that are essentially humanoid, but don't really have very many human characteristics. You can see a little rough anatomy. We could tell that they're female figurines based on the way the front of the things are decorated, basically with the bosom being protruding slightly. So probably goddess figurines that represent fertility. That would be the theory. And the term Pelasgian, I think I also went over that when we talked about the Archaic period as a term that is used variously among the ancients, and even the moderns tend to debate as to what exactly it refers to or who exactly it refers to. But one theory, and the way I'm going to be using it, is for the pre-Greek peoples of the mainland of Greece. We can call them maybe the indigenous peoples. And one of the theories is that these people were agricultural people that worshiped the mother goddess prior to the arrival of the Greeks around 2000 BC. Now, if we're going to assume that these people had a matriarchal religion and the Greeks come in with a patriarchal religion, we can talk about this concept of merging the two religions, and what we can talk about in religious or even mythological terms as a hieros gamos, a holy marriage between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother. This is a recurring archetypal motif, I guess you could say, in mythology, not just from this particular place in the world, but you find it in various other mythological traditions. So it's kind of a metaphor for fertility. The Sky Father, which rains down upon the earth, his seed produces life from the ground. Okay, and the theory is that these pre-Greek Pelasgian people had these fertility rites already and the mother goddess in place, and then all of a sudden you've got these early Indo-European Greek people moving in with their Sky Father, and the premier Sky Father figure from that culture would be the god Zeus. Okay, now there are other sky gods, and even in Greek mythology, one overthrows another. So if you're familiar with like the theogony of Hesiod, you could talk about the god Uranos, early god of the heavens, being overthrown by his son Kronos, who is then in turn overthrown by his son Zeus. So they get this struggle of the generations, but it's always the Sky Father at the top. And then Zeus, who comes in with these Greek people, would have then been married off or paired up with various Earth Mother figures. And the primary Earth Mother figures in Greek mythology are figures like Gaia and Rhea and Demeter and even Hera. And the theory is that as Zeus is brought into various places, he would have been paired up with different mother goddesses, whatever mother goddess was predominant in any particular region. And the Greeks, being people that practice monogamy, the idea of only one husband and wife, would have had Zeus at some point married officially to some mother goddess, probably from a region where you have a fairly strong city-state. So, for instance, Argos, which was a place that the goddess Hera had a very important role and was also one of the early strong city-states of the Peloponnesus. So one of the theories is that because of Argos's early position of predominance, it's perhaps the case that Zeus ends up taking on Hera as his official wife, and then what happens with Zeus and all these other little marriages in other places, those are kind of passed off in Greek mythology as all these love affairs that he has, extramarital affairs outside of Hera. So if you're familiar again with Greek religion, you know that Zeus pretty much sleeps with everybody that he comes across, with some very minor exceptions. Okay, so you end up getting this really interesting, I guess, narrative tradition that is not necessarily a tradition that is supposed to explain morality, but I'm going to get into that a little bit more in just a bit. So a mixture of these two religions, the Sky Father, the Earth Mother. Now, the whole idea of, whether or not this kind of patriarchal religion displacing a matriarchal religion is actually true, like I said, there's not a lot of evidence for that outside of myth and the figurines that we're looking at. Like I said, the linear B tablets have kind of a 50-50 pairing, so it's obvious that the Mycenaeans themselves worship gods and goddesses pretty much equally. And in the myth, when we talk about maybe a father god replacing a mother god, a few myths that turn up that kind of point in this direction would be things like the story of Apollo versus Python. I'm going to talk about Delphi a little bit later in this lecture, but this myth actually is about the conquest of that particular religious site, the site of Delphi, by the god Apollo, who is probably the most Greek of all the gods. And the story is that originally that sanctuary belonged to the Earth Mother Gaia, and there was a great dragon or serpent that was her, guardian of the sanctuary, known as the Python. And when Apollo arrives, he slays the Python, just one of those early, dragon slayer stories, and ends up taking over the sanctuary for himself. So that could be an example of, this father figure, this god replacing the goddess at a particular location. Another parallel story would be the battle between Zeus and the dragon Typhon. Okay. Contrary to that, you also have other stories where you've got male gods and goddesses in competition. At Athens, you've got the famous story of Poseidon in his contest with Athena. This isn't a battle, but it's the contest for the patronage of the city. And in that story, each of these gods offered the Athenians a particular gift. Poseidon offers the Athenians a saltwater spring, and Athena offers the Athenians an olive tree. And the Athenians actually pick which god they're going to make their patron, and you probably already know who wins, because the city's not called Poseidonia, it's called Athens. So Athena wins the contest. So in that particular story, obviously the mother goddess, and technically Athena is a virgin goddess, so you don't want to think of her as a mother goddess in the form we know her, but it's very possible that there was an earlier form of Athena as a mother goddess, but again, that's pure speculation. But again, the goddess comes out on top and not the god. Not that they didn't worship Poseidon, because they did maintain sanctuaries and altars and things to him as well. But that story, might show you a little bit of an alternative picture, okay? It's not as clear-cut. And anytime we're trying to speculate as to what the actual religious practices were or religious beliefs were of these earlier generations based on mythology, it's going to be really, really difficult, because these are stories. Right? They're important stories. A lot of times they teach us about some of the big concerns of different groups and try to address certain concerns, but they don't necessarily give us an actual picture of religious activity. Okay? So be aware of that. What the gods are like in myth is not necessarily what the average Greek believed the gods were in reality. Okay? So let's move on to what we know about when we get to the historical period, the archaic period and beyond. Greek religion. It's essentially what we would call a civic religion, which means it's tied to the city-state. Okay? Now, there is no founder for this religion, right? The origins, like we said, kind of move from the Mycenaean era through the Dark Ages into the Archaic period as an evolving set of beliefs and practices, right? There's no major prophet, there's no Muhammad, there's no Moses, there's no Jesus, there's no religious texts, there's no point when we can say this is when the religion began. It's just a natural growth. Okay, and of course, it can grow differently in different places, which is why Greek myth evolves the way it does with contradictory stories and different variations regionally. Same thing would be true of religious activity, so which we can call cult activity. I'm going to use the word cult a little bit later. I probably should introduce it right now because the word cult just refers to religious practice, and I don't want you guys to have in mind some kind of negative idea. I know today a lot of people think of the word cult as some kind of weird variation on a traditional religion that involves maybe brainwashing or anything like that. That's not how we use the term in academics. Cult is just religious practice and activity, and it's the same root word where we get culture and cultivate from. Okay, so Greek cult evolves differently in different places, and each city-state is going to have its own particular cult and its own particular traditions. Now, in the polis, in the city-state, we want to remember that there's no distinction between church, and I'm putting that in quotes, and state, okay, or between cult and state. Religion and the state are intimately connected. The idea of separating the two is a rather modern phenomenon. The state looked to the gods or the divine realm for certain security, for favor, for authority very often, as we even saw in Sumerian Egypt. There are public rituals, there are festivals, and your activity as a citizen, because we can talk about citizenship in the Greek world, would often involve almost mandatory participation in the religious life of the community. Okay, it gave you a cultural identity. Now, even though there is a great deal of freedom in private, there is kind of this idea that if you don't participate in the civic religion, you are in some sense not a good citizen. You are potentially jeopardizing the security of the state, because if the gods do exist, right, in Athens, if Athena is the patron and watches over the city, and if you repudiate Athena altogether or deny her or fail to sacrifice to her, the average person would view that as a dangerous thing. Remember, the gods have power, right? And they could, bring a city down just as well as they could support a city in its prosperity. Okay, so it's always a matter of outward action. Okay, what you do in private, what you believe in private, that's up to you. You just want to refrain from blasphemy or shirking your religious duties in the public sphere. Okay? So that's the idea of what we're talking about, civic religion. It's not a personal faith. It's something very different. It's an outward working of patriotism. All right? So when it comes to this discussion about belief and civic responsibility, belief is in the background of this kind of system. And I probably should try to distinguish, set doctrine from general belief. Because anytime you've got religious practice that is conducted, there are certain assumptions that lie behind that, right? For instance, if you're going to make a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice or whatever, to the gods, there's obviously the assumption that the gods exist and that the gods can do something, that your sacrifice will have some kind of benefit to the state or to the individual. So when I'm talking about belief in this context here, I'm talking about your private belief, which really didn't matter whatsoever, all right? It's a non-creedal religious system. There are no doctrine. It's not dogmatic. There aren't a certain set of beliefs you have to subscribe to. It's not a system. There aren't teachings. Okay, so it's going to vary not only from city-state to city-state, but it's going to vary from person to person. What you believe in your home, you could be a complete atheist among the Greek world, and there were plenty of philosophers that we can consider atheists. There were plenty of philosophers that weren't necessarily atheists, but still denied the polytheistic traditions and the mythological traditions that we see in Homer and Hesiod, like Xenophanes, who's a very much mocked the Olympian system, but he himself held to some type of divinity that we can maybe characterize him as a type of monotheist. You see a lot of that among the philosophers. And then you have the average people that would probably, general polytheists, believed in the general mythology and the Olympian system. But again, it doesn't matter what you believe privately so long as you don't promote it publicly at the expense of the state cult. Okay, so that's the idea. All right, so it's a civic religion. Now, as far as the general view of the Greek people, you've got classes of gods we could talk about. You've got the Olympians. They're the ones that are the gods up above, right? There's a place in northern Greece known as Mount Olympus. This was viewed as the place where the gods dwell, the gods of the air. And they were the 12 major deities. And the list of 12 does vary from writer to writer, but we could talk about a general collection of gods. Zeus, for instance, will always be at the top of the list. All right, Zeus is always an Olympian. I don't think he's ever not on the list. All right, and they're going to provide the general authority structure. So if we talk about a world order or even a moral order, these gods are supposed to oversee that. They're like the judges of all. They're the ones that maintain the system. Even though they're not themselves moral beings the way we see them in myth, like I said a second ago, Zeus is, he's a philanderer. He has affairs on his wife. He is usually characterized as really very immoral. They can be very petty. They are not the types of characters that you would expect human beings to emulate. Okay, but that wasn't the point of the myth. You could still learn moral truths by reading Greek myth. Often, look at the characters and see how they behave and how their lives go wrong, and you'll at least learn how not to behave. But they do provide some kind of moral system in an abstract sense, right? So that's why you want to realize that what you see in mythology is not the same as what people believed in religious tradition. The general list will include some gods like this. So here's Zeus. We got a couple images that I'm bringing up, and I just want to emphasize that idea of anthropomorphic depiction of the gods. On the top, you see a red figure vase painting, which shows Zeus carrying the thunderbolt, and on his front hand, even though it looks like a pigeon, it's supposed to be an eagle, which is his bird. Below, you see a wonderful surviving Greek bronze statue from the classical period. Now, the bronze statues were the most common type of statue in the ancient Greek world. There were lots and lots of bronze statues made by the ancient Greeks. Most of them are gone now, and that was because people tended to come along and reuse the metal. They could be easily melted down. Metal was valuable, so especially when the worship of these gods kind of faded from existence, the metal was still desired by later groups. Anyways, this particular example survived, and there are a good number that have survived, but this one survived because it was in a shipwreck off the coast of Artemision in Greece. This was found in the modern era, brought back up to the surface and kind of fixed up a little bit, and the identification has been a matter of debate. Originally, people hailed it as the statue of Poseidon. Other people believe it's a statue of Zeus, but here's the deal. You can't tell who it is because of the anthropomorphic tradition of depicting their gods. There are no distinguishing physical characteristics like you would see in a Ra or an Isis or a Thoth that we see in Egypt, right? It's just a guy with a beard. And the only way you would be able to tell who it is would be some kind of implement or object that he might hold in his hand. And you can notice his right hand is empty. It was holding something originally. Now, if it was a trident, which is a fisherman's spear, then it would be Poseidon. If it was a thunderbolt, which you see in the painting up above it, which kind of looks a little bit like a very small trident, then it would be Zeus. All right, so we can't tell based on the figure, only by the tools. If he was holding a club in his hand, it would be a statue of Heracles. But I think most people tend to believe it was Zeus, and I'm going to go with Zeus myself. So here's the king of the gods. He's the lead god, and as a character that wields the thunderbolt, he's the god of storms. Okay, married to him is the goddess Hera, who is the goddess of childbirth, goddess of marriage, the queen of the gods. Poseidon, his brother, god of the seas, god of horses, earthquakes, and various other things. Hestia, goddess of the hearth. This is kind of this early generation of gods, the generation that follows the Titans, which would have been a previous generation. And in the mythology, these gods wage war against the Titans. Demeter, another sister. There are 5 siblings according to Hesiod, and Demeter is the great mother goddess, the goddess of grain. Now, there's a 6th member of this little family, and that's a god that I'll refer to in a second. I'm not going to put him into this list because he's generally put into a different category, and that would be Hades. So we'll come back to him shortly. But filling out the list, you have other characters like Aphrodite, who's a goddess of love, desire, sexuality, and beauty. Sometimes she's the daughter of Zeus. Sometimes she's created by the castration of the god Uranus, again, depending on which poem you read. Athena, who we already talked about, a goddess of wisdom and war and skill and craft. Very important goddess, one of the major virgin goddesses and a patron of the city of Athens, which is one of the 2 city-states we really focused on earlier. Artemis, who is the goddess of the hunt. Apollo, her twin brother, who is probably, like I said, the most Greek of all the Greek gods, which is kind of strange because when you read Homer, he is one of the gods that sides with the Trojans against the Greeks. And what we know from records in Anatolia, he seems to have been a god worshipped by the Anatolians, and probably was an import from the East to the Greek world. But he becomes the most Greek of the Greek gods. He's a god of medicine. He's a god of poetry and music. He's a god of balance and harmony, and a number of other things, even associated with the sun. Okay, this is a picture of him sitting on his tripod, which was kind of this little throne that he had, which was placed in the temple at Delphi, and he is playing his lyre, which is a musical instrument that he's associated with. We'll come back to him a little bit later. Hephaestus, god of blacksmiths. Ares, the god of war. Hermes, the messenger god, the god of travelers and crossroads, and the one who leads the dead to the underworld. You can see him in the red figure vase painting down here in the corner where he's wearing the traveler's cap and he's carrying the caduceus, which is his symbol. And he's overseeing the removal of the fallen, I believe it's Sarpedon, it's a scene from the Trojan War story. Okay, so there's a few different gods, but notice the only reason you could tell that's Hephaestus and the one above him is Apollo is not because of what they look like, but because of the items that they're carrying, the lyre and the caduceus respectively. Okay, without those, they look just like any other Greek guy. The other group of gods that we could refer to would be the gods not of the heavens, but the gods of the earth and the underworld. They're called the Chthonic gods, and they represent life and fertility as well as death. And this makes sense because the earth is both the place that produces crops, but also the place that receives the dead, right? Whether you are burying the body the way the Mycenaeans did with their inhumation practices, where you actually, build these tombs in the earth, like thalos tombs or shaft graves or cyst graves, or whether you're, like the later Greeks, cremating your dead and placing the urns again in the earth. The idea is the earth receives the dead, and then out of the earth comes new life. This is the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, something that is investigated in mythology and religion around the world from culture to culture. Okay, so these gods could be very close to us, very beneficial to us, but at the same time they could be terrifying, right? Because they represent the loss of life. Some examples, of course, Hades, right? Hades is one of the brothers. They're the 3 brothers and 3 sisters that we just looked at from, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and then Demeter, Hera, and Hestia. Now, Hades drew the lot that earned him the position of the underworld. The 3 brothers drew lots for dividing up the world. Zeus got the heavens, Poseidon got the seas, and Hades got the underworld. And even though it sounds like a raw deal, it's actually the biggest of all the kingdoms, right? It's the kingdom where you continually have a growing population. It's also the underworld, which has all the great wealth, the gold, the silver, the gems, the things that you mine, metal resources. That all belongs to Hades. So he's also known as the wealthy god by the Greeks. Plutos, which is the word for wealthy in Greek. It's not just the Roman counterpart to Hades, it is Hades. Now Hades, because he's the god of the dead, is not necessarily a god that you want to call attention to, or you don't want to call his attention to you, rather. So you try to avoid saying his name. And one of the beliefs among various people groups would be that if you say the name of a god, then they will, respond in some way. So you don't want the god of death, taking notice of you, because that could, bring about your death in some way. So they very, very often refer to Hades by using other terms, more positive terms, kind of, I don't want to say to kiss up to Hades, but to appease him in a certain way. He'd often be referred to as Chthonian Zeus, for instance. Right, so it's kind of this lofty name, Zeus. He's the king, Chthonian, because he's from the earth. So this is another way to refer to him. And in this particular statue, you actually see him next to his favorite pet, his famous guard dog. And if you're familiar at all with Harry Potter, for instance, you might have seen something like this: the three-headed hound that guards the underworld. Right, Fluffy from the Sorcerer's Stone, the first book or movie from the series. This is the dog that guards. Anybody know the name of? It's not actually called Fluffy in Greek mythology. Anybody know the name of this dog in Greek mythology? The guard dog, by the way, is designed not to keep people out of his realm, but to keep people in his realm, the realm of the underworld. His name is Cerberus. Okay, sometimes he's depicted much larger than that, but again, three-headed hound of Hades. Then you also have other characters like Demeter and Persephone that we could throw into this group. And I know Demeter was just on our list for Olympian gods, but she is also a chthonic deity, being the goddess of grain, the goddess of the earth, fertility, and her daughter Persephone. And there's a wonderful story. It's often called the rape of Persephone, which doesn't sound so wonderful, but the story of Demeter and Persephone involves the god Hades, who is promised the hand of Persephone, the maiden daughter of Demeter, by Zeus, and Hades ends up abducting Persephone secretly and whisking her off to the underworld to become his bride. And Demeter, in her grief, allows the entire earth to go barren and die. And some interpret this story as a myth talking about the death of the crops that comes every winter, and then the return of Persephone to her mother. In the spring, you have life spring forth again. So it's kind of a nature myth interpretation, but there is a lot more to it than that. But again, there's this idea of death and rebirth. There's an idea of fertility, all this kind of stuff interwoven into that story. So it's a great example of the chthonic gods and their interaction. This particular picture, I'll show you a different vase, has a similar picture in a second when we get to the mystery cults, because this particular scene is actually associated with the mysteries of Eleusis. And in the picture, you've got Demeter and Persephone on either side of a figure known as Triptolemus, who is one of the figures who teaches mankind how to farm and cultivate grain, someone who is taught by Demeter herself to do this, kind of a missionary from Eleusis to the world. Anyways, Dionysus we could also throw into this category. You may have heard of him as a god of wine and revelry. A lot of times he's looked at as really this jovial figure, kind of a happy god. But there's actually a very, very dark side to Dionysus, and we'll concentrate on that more when we get to Greek drama, because that's a whole tradition in ancient Greece that is attached to the god Dionysus. So we'll actually look at his mythology and imagery and symbolism when we get to drama later. But for now, let's just say he's also a god of fertility, the earth, the vine, the things that bring forth life. And there is a dark side. He's also a god of death. So let's hold off on that. In his hand, by the way, is this item known as the thyrsus, which is associated with worshipers. So we see characters carrying something like this in Greek vase painting or sculpture. Generally, it's going to be a devotee of the god Dionysus. So we'll come back and look at one of his cults a little bit later today. All right, so those are the basic gods. And again, there are lots of other deities. Not every deity has a story. Not every deity is a major figure. But that's a small collection of some of the prominent ones that you should definitely be aware of. So let's turn our attention now to festivals. The Greeks had religious festivals. We already talked about one of them, the Olympics. This is the most famous of all the Greek festivals. This is what is called a Pan-Hellenic festival. Pan-Hellenic means this would be a festival for all of Greece to participate in. Now remember, the Greek city-states generally did not get along very well with each other. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes make alliances, sometimes they're at each other's throats. Okay? But at the same time, they all recognized that they share a single culture, and they would gather together for these major festivals, the most important being Olympics. This began around 776. That's the official date of the first Olympics, and it was held at a place known as Olympia in the Peloponnesus. I gave you the map last time, and this is actually a photo of the archway that leads into the area of the sanctuary where the foot race was held, into the stadium. That flat area in the distance is where the run would take place. It's a straightaway. It's not a circular track as we think of today, but it was the premier event in the Olympics. It involved athletic competitions of various sorts. So again, this may be strange to think of a religious festival dedicated to Zeus as involving a competition of sport. So some of the sports, by the way, you've probably heard of, because a lot of these sports are still practiced today and still associated with the modern Olympics, which, modeled on the ancient Olympics, happen every 4 years. And the foot race, here's a black figure vase showing the foot race. Notice also the runners are not wearing clothing. This was a standard way of competing in athletics for the Greek world. And there is an interesting story that is supposed to explain why they compete in the nude, and it has to do with the foot race. And the idea was originally they used to wear clothes as they ran, but in one particular event or one particular year, the loincloth fell off one of the runners, and he ended up winning the race. And they decided that it's much easier to run without being encumbered by any kind of clothing, and that becomes a tradition. Now, I don't know if that's actually how it happened. This is, one of those stories that's made up to explain something, but the Greeks did do their athletics in the nude, and it wasn't just the race. It was pretty much every event, with maybe the exception of things like the chariot race, which doesn't really matter how you're dressed if you're driving a chariot. The horses are naked. But the foot race was a very famous one. The event, long jump, for instance. I pulled up a few photos that I could share with you guys. They had discus, they had the javelin toss, boxing, long jump was a little bit strange. Actually, all of these are a little bit different than we practice them today. This particular picture shows a long jumper in the midst of a jump, and notice in his hands he's carrying what look like these two little baskets. They're actually weights. And when they did the long jump in ancient Greece, they would actually carry hand weights, and as they were in the air, they would throw their arms backward and release the weights, apparently to give them an extra push forward, to give them a little bit more distance. Now, I don't know how effective this was, because I'm sure carrying the weights slowed you down in the beginning of the jump, but this is how they tried it. Boxing, right? You think of boxing with these padded gloves today. Back in the day, they didn't wear padded gloves. They may have wore very rough leather to protect their knuckles a little bit, but there was no padding, so it could be incredibly brutal. People died boxing in the Olympics. And then also you have wrestling, which might be the most uncomfortable sport to do in the nude, but wrestling, the idea of throwing your opponent to the ground, very, very, very big sport in the ancient Greek world. And then they would actually even, over time, add new events and even combine events. I mentioned that the Greeks ran in the nude. There was an event where they actually would run in armor. Okay, that would be a modification. The wrestling and boxing were combined into an event called the Pancration, which is kind of a no-holds-barred MMA-style fight with very little rules. So things evolve over time. But again, there's a spirit of competition. There's an idea of representing your city-state, bringing prestige back to the homeland. And if you were a successful athlete or a victor at the Olympics, your home state would often provide you with, food and trophies, and you'd be like a superstar back home. Now, apart from the Olympics, there were other competitions and festivals. The second great Pan-Hellenic festival was the Pythian Games. These were held pretty much from the 6th century on at the place known as Delphi. So here we go, a visual of the sanctuary of Apollo that I've already mentioned. And I will probably mention it again a little bit later. But here you see the theater of Apollo, theater at Delphi, overlooking what is at the base there, the ruins of the Temple of Apollo. And this is a gorgeous, gorgeous site on the side of Mount Parnassus in central Greece. And you can see down into the valley and all the way out to the bay on a clear day. So it really was a place that appeared to be somewhat divine. It's no wonder the Greeks picked this as a sanctuary that was really an important religious site. It's not a city. There was a little town there, but it was a religious center. And they would have an event every 4 years, just like the Olympics. It would be held in the third year of an Olympiad. So remember, the Olympics were the way Greeks tended to take note of their chronology, right? A 4-year cycle, and they could date events based on this Olympiad or that Olympiad. So in the third year of an Olympiad, the first year was the Olympics, the third year, the Pythian Games. And by the way, the name is not the Delphic Games or the Apollonian Games. They're the Pythian Games because of the Python in the myth, which lends its name to the priestess at Delphi, which was known as the Pythia. Okay, we'll talk about the Pythia a little bit later. The third Pan-Hellenic festival was the Isthmian Games. These were held near Corinth, the Isthmia, and those would be sacred to Poseidon. And these would be held every 2 years, on the first and the third year of an Olympiad. The other figure that's often associated with these games is Melicertes or Palæmon Melicertes, and that's kind of a minor figure. There's a myth about the queen of Boeotia, known as Ino, committing suicide with her child Melicertes as they jump into the sea at Corinth after being chased by her crazed husband. The name, though, is kind of interesting because Melicertes seems to be a derivative from Phoenician, okay, the god in Phoenician of Moloch, Melkart. It's definitely a Phoenician word, referred to kings and stuff in the Semitic. But again, I mentioned when we talked about the early archaic period last time that there was a heavy Phoenician influence on early Greek culture, not only with the alphabet, but also in mythology and stories of people from Phoenicia settling in Greece. And them both being seafaring people, there's no wonder. There probably was a lot of interaction here. And Isthmia, remember, is a very strategically located place for shipping, right, at Corinth. Okay, the last of the great Pan-Hellenic festivals are the Nemean Games. Those are held near Argos at Nemea, sacred to Hera, but also Zeus. And this would be another 2-year cycle. This time the games were held on the second and the fourth years of an Olympiad. So if you look at the calendar, every year there's at least one, sometimes more than one, major Pan-Hellenic festival. By the way, I should have mentioned a second ago with places like the Pythian Games. These are not just athletic competitions that these all have, but you also have artistic competitions, music competitions, drama competitions. The Greeks like to compete in all kinds of ways. All right, so this is kind of the core of the Greek identity. Beyond the Pan-Hellenic Games, there are also other important festivals, and probably too many to mention, but I'll just mention 2 that are associated with the city of Athens that are rather important. Both of them apparently attributed to the great tyrant Pisistratus in the 6th century, but the Pan-Hellenic again means for all Greece. It doesn't matter where you are from Greece, whether you're a Doric city or an Ionic city, you're all welcome to participate together. That's what Pan-Hellenic is. Pan means all. Hellenic, remember, is the term for Greek people. Our other important festivals, the Pan-Athenaia in Athens, as would be obvious by the name perhaps. This would be an event that would be held actually every year. Every 4th year there would be a major blowout version of it, basically centered around a procession through the Agora up to the Acropolis, bringing a new garment for the statue of Athena that resided on the Acropolis. But it also had athletic competitions and things like that too, because you can't have religion without a winner. And then you've got the city Dionysia, which we're going to talk about when we get to drama, because this was actually a civic event that involved the theater. Okay, this was dedicated to Dionysus, sometimes called the city Dionysia or the greater Dionysia to distinguish it from the rural or lesser Dionysia. And again, there's competition, this time in drama. So we'll talk about that when we get to drama a little bit later on. But interesting phenomenon. It's very foreign to the modern mind to think of religion practiced this way. But it sounds kind of fun. Anyways, let's talk a little bit about beliefs. Like I said, there are no hard and fast doctrines you have to hold to as an ancient Greek person. You can be an atheist, you could be a polytheist, you could be a monotheist, as long as you do your duty when it comes to civic responsibility. But they did have general beliefs that you'll find throughout Greece, such as a belief in fate, a belief in prophecy. And the whole issue of fate we could look at as we go through this semester, because it's going to come up and up again and again, not only with respect to religion, but when you guys get to reading some plays. I know one of the groups is going to be doing a presentation on Oedipus Rex, one of the great tragedies of the 5th century. One of the main themes of that story is the idea of fate, right? Free will versus determinism. The ancient Greek philosophers are going to bring up that question. This is a question that has been with human culture all the way into the modern scientific era. We still have a discussion today about whether or not we are determined as human beings or whether we're free human beings. But the Greeks definitely had a place for fate in their worldview, the idea that there are certain things that are predetermined. There were 3 women called the Fates. They determine the length of your life, when you die. The gods themselves are kind of subject to fate. And if there are things that are predetermined, it opens up the possibility that there are beings that can know the future and prophesy. So the Greeks took that kind of stuff seriously. Dodona was a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus, where people would go and try to receive prophetic utterances from the priests of Zeus. Delphi is the one that I've been talking about over and over again, associated with Apollo and the Pythia. And the way it would work at Delphi is kind of an interesting scenario. There would be this priestess, the Pythia, who in some eras was an old woman, in some eras a young woman. It kind of changed from time to time. But the priestess, supposedly, when you come to visit and bring forth a question, would, when she was going to prophesy, go and purify herself. She would bathe in the spring up there at Mount Parnassus. She would chew on laurel leaves. She would go into the temple of Apollo, sit in the tripod in the back room of the temple, and apparently in that room there was a fissure in the earth that this tripod sat upon, and vapors would come up from the underworld, and she would inhale these vapors and go into a trance-like state where she would begin to babble incoherently, and then there would be these priests that would then translate her incoherent babblings into some kind of verse poetry, and then they would present the answers to the people who asked the question. They would always be pretty vague. I think last time we talked about the Persian Wars, I talked about the Athenians going to Delphi and asking what to do with the Persians on the way towards their city, and they were told to seek refuge behind their wooden walls, which was interpreted by some as actually building wooden walls around the Acropolis and making a last stand against the Persians, and others interpreted it as taking to the ships and abandoning the city and going off to Salamis. And of course, people that went to Salamis survived. The people that stayed in Athens died. That was an idea of, this prophecy that can be interpreted in more than one way. Gives you a little bit of security if you're the one giving the prophecy that, you were right. You just had somebody interpret it incorrectly. But there are lots of fun stories about these types of prophecies. I mean, those are the big ones. The story of the Persians, again, I can even go back a little bit further to the 6th century when the great King Cyrus was invading Anatolia. The king of Lydia, a guy by the name of Croesus, who was a Philhellene, he was a lover of Greek culture, sent emissaries to Delphi to find out whether or not he should go ahead and engage Cyrus and the Persians and cross over this particular river to do battle against him. And the prophecy from Delphi was that if he crosses this river, he will destroy a great kingdom or a great empire. And Croesus, with confidence, goes ahead and crosses over and confronts Cyrus, and the great empire he destroyed was his own. Okay, so again, how you interpret it, it's up to you. The responsibility is not on the god. Yet people continue to send emissaries to Delphi to get political advice, a little bit of a glimpse of the future so that they could determine public policy. And you would wonder why they would do this, apart from the religious belief, but there's probably a practical side to it too, because with people from all over the Greek world and beyond coming to Delphi, right, emissaries from different governments, you can imagine that the priests at Delphi had a great opportunity to gather intelligence, information. They know what's going on in Athens. They know what's going on in Sparta or Corinth or Thebes, and they could probably give some pretty good advice. So it becomes a really important site. But the Greeks definitely believed in fate. And what happens when you meet your fate and you've got, I should have brought this up a second ago, but this is an artist's reconstruction of what the sanctuary at Delphi would look like. We're looking at the side of the mountain, and there would be a pathway that goes up, winds its way up the side of the mountain, and along the way you see all these little treasury buildings. These are little dedications from various city-states to Delphi, to the god Apollo, and statuary and a lot of wealth that was poured into Delphi by these emissaries, by these city-states coming there. The big building at the top there is the Temple of Apollo, as it possibly looked during the 5th century. And then beyond that, you can see a little bit of the theater, and even up higher, you would get to the stadium and the athletic centers and stuff. So it was an incredibly, incredibly beautiful site back then. And here's a picture of the Pythia sitting in her tripod with the laurel leaves in hand, getting ready to prophesy from a red figure vase painting. Anyways, when you meet your fate, of course, that means you go on to the great beyond, or whatever the Greeks conceived of as an afterlife. And that varied from person to person. Some people believed there was nothing after you died. There were a lot of atheistic philosophers that believed you live, you're a physical being, you die, you cease to exist. Others tended to believe in some type of soul. The general belief probably was that you would go to Hades, the underworld, which is not necessarily a place of punishment. It's just the place for the dead, home of the dead. And it could have different parts to it. I mean, the depictions of Hades in mythology vary from author to author. By the time you get to the great Latin poet Virgil, you have a very well-developed view of Hades with places of punishment, places of reward, and all kinds of other places in between. But Hades was just a general abode for the dead. Some people also believed in what's called transmigration, the idea that the soul would be reincarnated. Right? So you have a mixture of those beliefs. Sometimes immediately, sometimes the belief was you would go to Hades for a while and then be reincarnated. So again, it doesn't matter. Your personal beliefs, it varied. Another thing to talk about is worship. They did believe that worship had benefits. This is why they had sacrifices in the city-states. Sacrifice was basically this idea of offering something of value to the gods in exchange for their favor. I give so that you would give back is kind of the concept behind it, and that could involve blood, like animal sacrifice, but it could also involve food, like grain or wine or something poured out, a libation or something like that to the gods. And this would be a daily practice, whether it's in the individual home among a Greek family or whether it was in public. So before elections, before voting, before any kind of public activity, especially religious festivals, there would be sacrifices conducted. And these sacrifices would be conducted by anybody, state officials, elected officials, the heads of households. Anybody could offer a sacrifice to the gods and would offer a sacrifice. But they still had priests in addition. And the priest's job would often be an advisory role to make sure things were done the appropriate way so as not to offend the gods. So in the Greek world, priests tended not to evolve into a really powerful class the way they did in ancient Greece. In ancient Egypt, right, with the practice of mummification and preparation for the dead, preparation of the dead for the afterlife. It would be an expensive process, and a lot of people would depend on the priesthoods to provide those services. Here, not so much, okay? So, very different role of priesthoods in ancient Greece. All right, finally we were arriving at the mystery cults. This is the last section of the presentation, so I'm going to not necessarily slow down, but I'm going to focus on, number one, what mystery cults were, their main characteristics, and then I'm going to focus on 3 different cults, the 3 big ones of the earlier period of the Greeks. So the main characteristics of a mystery cult were, number one, this is a voluntary type of religion. The speculation is that mystery cults evolved probably out of a personal need. When we think of world religion or religion in general, we think of religion as being a personal thing, especially today. What you believe is a matter for yourself. You need to, follow the religion that makes sense for you. There are personal benefits and personal desires that are met in religious activity. Well, when it comes to the ancient Greek civil religion, there really wasn't anything personally satisfying in that, right? It might be your if I can get the words out, your role as a citizen to participate in these things, but it didn't necessarily promise you anything on an individual level. And a lot of people have analyzed world religions, noticed that there's often some type of a personal need that should be met in a good religion or a successful religion, which is why you see very often in the world religions different movements within certain traditions towards more personal, satisfying, and emotionally fulfilling activity. So in Hinduism, you have the Bhakti movement, a movement for devotion to a god. In Buddhism, you've got versions of Buddhism that are more personal. In Islam, you've got the Sufi movement. In the Jewish tradition, I guess Christianity sometimes is looked at as kind of a more personal form of religion as opposed to the Judaism of the first century AD. Anyways, the Greeks had their civil religion and then they had their mystery cults. You do not have to participate in mystery cult. It's not a duty. It's by desire. And if you do, you go through an initiation. And the initiation would involve some type of secret. Now, the initiation we don't know very much about because, or the different initiations we don't know much about because these secrets were kept pretty well by the ancients. We have little glimpses and clues here and there, and we speculate as to what exactly went on. But for the most part, it's just that, speculation. By going through an initiation, you become identified with the group, you become identified with the god, and because you share that secret, it makes it kind of this unique identity that nobody else knows about. This is what binds you together as a community of sorts, even if the group that you are part of isn't a group that meets regularly or continues to practice worship together, because some of these cults were kind of a one and done type of activity. You are initiated and then you go back to your normal life, hopefully transformed in some way, but still with these bonds to this secret. They often involve these chthonic gods, right? These are the gods of the earth, the underworld. These are the gods that we're more intimately connected with, and a lot of the speculation involves this idea that these cults would often have some kind of emphasis on the afterlife, right? Being associated with the gods of the earth and the underworld. Ceremonies and rituals that would involve an investigation of the mysteries of life and death and rebirth and such. But again, these are the gods that are close to us, and the idea is these chthonic gods would be the focus of devotion and often involve some type of union with the worshiper, some kind of intimacy. Okay, that would be very different than what you get by offering a sacrifice to Zeus back at the palace. Then you also have this idea of a reward or a blessing that comes from participating, whether it was a temporary blessing that lasted for a short amount of time or an eternal blessing of a better afterlife. It varied and changed from era to era and from cult to cult. Okay, so those are some general characteristics. And then there are a lot of distinctives. So one cult could be very different from another cult. These types of things would be in common. Now, we'll get later on to Hellenistic mystery cults and later on to Christianity. There are many who would group Christianity into the category of mystery cult because it does have a lot of similarities as far as major characteristics, again with some distinctions that we can point out when we get to that later down the road. For now, let's take a look at three of the big cults. First, the Eleusinian Mysteries. This was a mystery cult that involved worship of the goddess Demeter, Persephone, and Hades. And it was located or conducted at a place known as Eleusis, which is actually in Attica, very close to Athens. I forget how far, maybe about 14 miles or so from Athens, the city. It was conducted there in the month of Boedromion, which is basically around the time of September. And it would be a festival that lasted for a number of days, like 9 days. Here you see a picture of the goddess Demeter, and here another image of a red figure vase painting, very similar to the one I showed you before with Triptolemus and Demeter Persephone. Now, Kore is a title or a name often given to Persephone. It means the maiden. So it's linked to the myth of Kore, which is the myth that I talked about before, the abduction of Persephone by Hades. And the whole myth is a symbolic death and rebirth story, both of nature, but it could also be used to express the fate of human beings and their descent to the underworld and possibly their afterlife or even return to life in some sense. So the mystery probably involved both nature and afterlife ideas. It was open to all kinds of people, which is one of the attractive aspects of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Men, women, slaves or free. Doesn't matter whether you're a citizen of Athens or a subject of Athens in the way of servitude. Anybody could participate, so it's egalitarian in that sense. The initiation, don't know a lot about it, but it definitely involved purification process back in Athens with a procession to Eleusis, where you make sacrifice, you fast for a period of time, you're eventually given a particular drink known as kakan, which is probably some kind of drink made out of barley, grain. You go into a room or a building known as the telesterion, which is kind of an underground chamber, where there would be a priest and two priestesses who would introduce you to some kind of sacred objects, the hieroi. They would reveal these objects to you, and we don't know what the objects were. Some speculate some kind of sexual imagery. Some speculate as to the grain, an image of an ear of grain or something like that. But whatever it was, people were sworn to secrecy, and then you go back to your normal life. This wasn't a permanent community, but it was an important and long-lived practice. This actually lasted all the way until Christianity became the official religion of Rome at the end of the 4th century AD, under the time of Theodosius, who closes down a lot of these sanctuaries and festivities during his reign. Okay, and the whole sanctuary at Eleusis is ultimately abandoned by 396. Okay, so that's the Eleusinian Mysteries. If you ever read the myth of Demeter Persephone, I should have mentioned, there is a point in the story after the abduction of Persephone where Demeter is wandering around looking for her child, and she ends up going to Eleusis, where she takes care of the infant baby that belongs to the king and queen of Eleusis, and attempts to give this child immortality by roasting him in a fire. And she continues this night after night until this ceremony is interrupted by the king and queen, who then, doom their child to a mortal death. But in response to this interruption, she ends up instituting the Eleusinian Mysteries, and she teaches them to the children, Demophoon, the baby, and his brother Ptolemy, who's the one that you see in the picture here. So that particular myth also includes the background for where these mysteries come from. Okay, so they're pretty important. The next cult is the Bacchic cult, and this is the cult of Dionysus, and it was really popular, but also a more suspicious cult because there were lots of rumors as to what went on among the Bacchae, the worshippers of Dionysus. Now, this cult was an ecstatic cult, which meant it had to do with ecstasy, the idea of possession from the divine. The word entheos means the indwelling of a deity, or the word enthusiasmos, which is the idea of the state of being possessed. The worshippers of Dionysus would often go into some type of state of possession. That's kind of the goal of going through the Bacchic ritual, to become possessed by the god Dionysus and transformed into another state of consciousness. Now, it's tied to a very elaborate myth, which involves the birth of Dionysus or Zagreus, which I'll cover later, like I said, when we do drama. But there is an element of the story that involves death and rebirth, or death and reincarnation. Okay, so there is, again, that aspect of death and rebirth with the Bacchic mysteries. And it was popular among the marginalized, again, slaves, particularly women, who didn't have a very big role to play in most Greek city-states. And again, non-Greeks also participated in the Bacchic cult. And these rituals were conducted apparently in the wilderness. They would go away from the cities. They would go off in groups to worship Dionysus. And what happens out there in the wilderness stays in the wilderness, right? You don't know. They didn't talk about this, as we said. There was a secret. So you can imagine with women who tended to be somewhat secluded publicly and were relegated to the home in places like Athens, when they go off and worship Dionysus in the wilderness, there are all kinds of rumors that would circulate as to what on earth they were doing out there. And the accusations, some of these we're pretty sure of, that they, whatever the practices were, involved drinking of wine and intoxicants, dancing and revelry, but other things as well. The idea of possibly sexual orgies, not necessarily cannibalism, though you do see that in some of the mythology, but eating raw animals, tearing raw animals apart, running around the woods in these mad frenzies, One of the ideas of a worshiper, I think I used the term maenad before, or a bacchae, or bacchant. Those are kind of interchangeable. Those are the worshippers of Dionysus, and the word maenad is where we get the word mania from, or maniac, right? So here's a wonderful fresco from the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii, wonderfully preserved city. This villa is a little bit on the outskirts of the actual city of Pompeii, but it's definitely worth going to if you ever go to Pompeii. Try to get to the Villa of the Mysteries. It's named after this particular room in the villa where you have the god Dionysus front and center here, and the worshippers of Dionysus, a number of satyrs and other figures surrounding him. And in the corner, you actually see a woman being whipped by this figure with wings. That's on the right-hand side of the picture. So whether there were, whippings involved in the initiation rites for the worship of Dionysus, it's hard to know because, again, the practice probably differed from place to place, and this is obviously Roman era material, 1st century AD painting. But again, speculation. We also see some of the speculation expressed in here's a picture of a maenad, by the way, again, carrying the thyrsus that we saw with Dionysus in the other picture. And here, dressed in the garb of a maenad, which everybody would wear, carrying a wild animal, which she has apparently grabbed hold of in her hair. You've got a snake woven in there. So it's this really wild woman of nature. And if you want to get a little bit of a glimpse of the cult, you could read Euripides' Bacchae. I gave you an excerpt from this in the very first lecture of the semester, where you have the Prince Pentheus go out to watch his mother and his aunts worship the god Dionysus, and his mother Agave, eventually driven mad by the god, leaps upon him and tears him limb from limb, and then comes back into town carrying his head, right? This decapitation scene as she walks back into town. So that's kind of the culminating scene in the play. Kind of gruesome, but again, this is the speculation as to what these women were doing out there worshiping Dionysus. The last cult that we'll talk about, this one is actually a permanent cult. This is a community that met regularly and formed an entire identity and actually had doctrine and theology and study involved, very different from the average Greek cult. This was the Orphic cult, centering around the hero god Orpheus. He is also connected to Dionysus, so this involves a little bit of theology involving Dionysus, particularly the birth of Dionysus story that we'll get to later, the birth of this character Zagreus. But the myth of Orpheus, you may have heard of him. He's one of the Argonauts. He is a musician who went into the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice in the famous myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And he charms Cerberus and eventually is given permission by Hades to bring his wife back to the upper world, so long as he doesn't turn around and look at her before they both exit the underworld. And in the tragic story, of course, he turns around at the very end and sees her right before she crosses the threshold, and immediately she is dragged back into the underworld, and he loses her forever. And in the story, he goes on, distraught, and eventually kind of shuns women and love. And some of the maenads who worship Dionysus come upon him, and when he kind of rebuffs them, they leap upon him and tear him limb from limb, and the decapitated head of Orpheus is found, floating down the river, where it continues to prophesy, and it's kind of this mystical and interesting story, which I'm definitely butchering and abbreviating in an unjust way. But anyways, this was a communal cult. There was a lifestyle you had to adopt if you decided to become an Orphic, which involved certain beliefs about the body and soul. Their theology of the Orphics involved the idea that there was a body which was a prison house for this soul, the soma, the body, and the tsuke, the soul, which were distinct. The real you, of course, is the soul, which dwells in the body, and it goes from life to life via reincarnation, this transmigration. And it's a type of punishment. It's a state that we want to escape from, to liberate the soul from the body. And to liberate the soul from the body involved living a particular life while you were in the body. Okay, so that once you die, you may not be reincarnated. And that was the Orphic life. And it was involving ascetic practices. So asceticism is the idea of shunning physical pleasure, shunning the physical, living a life of strict discipline, Vegetarianism was important, the idea of avoiding bloodshed. If you live this lifestyle, and I'm not going to give you any more details than that, if you live that Orphic lifestyle, then you will escape and eventually go on to a complete freedom of the soul in the afterlife. Okay? So you can imagine that that kind of belief system would definitely involve some type of permanent change, which is why this is probably more of the idea of a religion the way we think of it today, a practice that involves your daily living and beliefs and things like that. So you will see some of this in Greek religion, but again, the general Greek religious worldview is a religious worldview that is very flexible, even though you do have these traditions where you have theology and beliefs practiced. You know, there are an infinite number of ways Greek religion can manifest. It's kind of fun to read the myths, to study the religion, and see, you know, a great diversity of practices in the ancient Greek world. We'll see more of this as we go further and investigate other cults, other mystery cults, particularly in the Hellenistic era, and then eventually Roman religion. We'll see before we ever get to the great monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but that's all coming down the road. So for now, that is our quick overview of ancient Greek religion.